Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. Now, since the beginning of October this year, tens of thousands of mostly young men and women have marched on the streets of Iraq, facing sniper bullets, water cannons, sound bombs, stun grenades. These are just some of the kind of onslaught they are facing from the Iraqi forces there. They're demanding basic public services, they're demanding jobs, and they're blaming the government of rampant corruption. Now, according to a Transparency International report recently, Iraq is the 12th most corrupt country in the world. Security forces and militias have attacked protesters in an attempt to dissipate these demonstrations, taking over 300 lives and injuring more than 8,000, according to the UN. In Lebanon, a month later, the politicians are yet to address protesters' demands for a technocrat government, a non-sectarian electoral law, and early polls. Hundreds of thousands of people have taken to the streets. They're demanding an end to Lebanon's political system, where power is essentially distributed among ethnic and religious groups, a very similar system to how it's done in Iraq. Now, Lebanese protesters are asking for an independent government, which they believe is the only way to give them access to basic services such as electricity, to water, and to improve what is right now a financial crisis. With a 152% debt to GDP ratio, Lebanon right now is the third most indebted country in the world. And what we are also seeing now happening in Iran, after an abrupt announcement by the government authorities to hike petrol prices earlier this week, in order to blunt the crippling effect of the U.S. sanctions, this has essentially pushed the Iranis to take to the streets as well. Demonstrations have taken place in cities and towns across Iran, with drivers abandoning vehicles on highways, protesters blocking roads. Local security officials have estimated that 87,000 people have taken part in these protests in Iran. Now, there's a common thread here that stands out. It's not only about the demographic that is involved in these protests. There is a younger crowd that is taking a stand against corrupt ruling class in some of the most oil-rich countries in the world. So what are the similarities and how this will move forward? What is Iran's influence in the neighborhood? We'll find out from our guests. Let me introduce who will be joining us today. We have Mr. Lawk, Ghafuri, a journalist who's joining us from Erbil, Iraqi Kurdistan. And we also have Mr. Szamuely, a Middle East expert. He's joining us from Budapest. Welcome to both of you to the show. Mr. Ghafuri, let me come to you here. If we can just address the basic sort of similarities, if you could spell out for us, what are, in your view, the similarities between the protests that are taking place here in Iraq, that are taking place in Lebanon, and now what we're seeing in Iran?
Well, Ayza, I think if we see the protesters that started in Lebanon and Iraq, they started against a government which is having so much influence from Tehran, from Iran. So and also from other regional countries. We are talking about like both countries, Lebanon and Iraq. They both have containing militias who are like having strong ties with Tehran. When we see the protesters that started in Tehran, in south of Tehran, like Iran, especially in Havas, we see that it started due to the increase of fuel price. But then it started to spread quickly into the other parts of Iran and starting to tearing off the posters of the supreme leader of Ali Khamenei, and also burning the Iranian flag, and which is it gives the message that the people now, they are not going for protesting against the increase of fuel price, but now they are protesting against the regime, which is the same happening in Iraq and Lebanon. In Iraq, till now, it's been like 26 days in a row people are protesting in the streets of Iraq against the regime, and the only demand now they have it's the change of the regime and the topple of the regime, because at the beginning they were protesting against the corruption, lack of basic services, unemployment, but now the story is changed. And I think in Lebanon is happening the same. The Lebanese people are always asking and demanding for independent government, and they don't want any more influence of the Islamic political party and also the other political party who are having a lot of interest from the government. And
okay,
this,
so let's hold that thought. Let's get Mr. Szamuely, you on board as well. Talking about these similarities, would you say also that Iran's interference in the governments is an essential common thread here?
No, I wouldn't really put it like that. I think the 800-pound gorilla in the room is the United States. I mean, what does Iran, Iraq, Lebanon have in common? Well, it's part of the Shiite crescent that is causing headaches in Tel Aviv. So there is something very odd that all these protests are taking place exactly here within the Shiite crescent that the United States finds objectionable. One needs to separate out the legitimate grievances of the protesters in Iraq and in Lebanon, because they have a lot to protest about, from the geopolitics. And the geopolitics is that the United States has been actively fighting against Hezbollah in Lebanon. It has been imposing sanctions on Lebanon. And so, that has played a key role in the hardships that have been imposed on Lebanon, because basically they're under sanction. I mean, the banks are under sanction because the United States accuses the banks of Lebanon of aiding Hezbollah. So you have to separate out for what the United States is trying to do. The United States is trying to use Iraq and Lebanon in its war against Iran. It's seeking to minimize the influence of Iran. And so this is part of what is really going on here. And I think this is what was stated by Ayatollah Sistani recently. He said, look, I sympathize with the protesters, but we also have to be aware of who's waiting in the wings, who's exploiting this, who is trying to affect regime change in Iraq in order to minimize the influence of Iraq. So we have to, just keep all these things separate.
So, okay, so let's revisit this conversation of reasons why Iran is getting a lot of heat from at least analysts around the world on the interference in these countries. Coming back to you, Mr. Ghafuri, if we are to just expand a little on US's role in what now seems like almost like an Arab Spring 2.0 happening in 2019, how would you say the US is linked or is responsible behind these demonstrations?
Well, if we see both Iraq and Lebanon, we see that the Iranian influence is very high, and U.S. is very concerned about this move. I believe in what's happening now, and especially after the 2 days ago, New York Times had a very detailed report about the leaked documents about the Iranian intelligence, that they willed power in Iraq. I see that the United States wants to move into fighting Iran, as George says, in Iraq and Lebanon, in a way that to cut the hands of Iran that is like exposing threat to Israel, especially to Iraq, because Iraq is a place, is a country that Iran can use to also transport military weapons into Syria, and that happened in the past. I think United States, in order to secure Israel in the region, they need to control the Iranian movement in Syria and also control the Hezbollah movement in Lebanon. And in order to do that, Iran needs to stop by the United States to move wider in the region, in the Middle East. And now we see that Iran is also very active in Yemen. And that's exposing also threats to the United States allies. So if we see all the movement around the Middle East region, we see that United States is moving into cutting the hands of Iran in the region. But I think that's going to be really hard, because Iran is really now we're talking about more than 65 units of militias who are having ties with Iran in Iraq. And we talk about Hezbollah, which is one of the strongest militias, I think, in the Middle East at the moment, and Houthis as well in Yemen.
So, Mr. Szamuely, I want to expand a little on US's role here. If there isn't a direct responsibility? Is there at least an encouragement? I mean, if we are to look at how these protests are unfolding, what we're seeing is that even a month later, so many deaths, so many detainments, so many disappearances of civilians, there is absolutely no movement in terms of this ruling elite class. They're not going anywhere, it seems. The demands of the protesters not being met. So could you see it in a way that the US actually endorses, President Trump actually endorses these regimes in power, at least for Iraq and Lebanon?
No, I don't think so. I think the United States is very happy to sow chaos in Iraq and in Lebanon. I think the United States sees chaos as its ally in its fight against Iran. I mean, if you look at Prime Minister Abdel Mahdi of Iraq, he has, in the past few months, he has been pursuing policies that the United States finds profoundly objectionable. He opened the border with Syria. He has facilitated the transfer of weapons from Iran to Syria. He has facilitated the transfer of oil from Iran to Syria. He has refused to endorse the U.S. sanctions regime against Iran, the part of the maximum pressure campaign. He has purchased electricity from Iran. He has also conducted massive trade deals with China. As part of the Belt and Road Initiative of China's. So you can see that he is somebody the United States does not like. The United States does not want him there. Therefore, when you see these protests in Iraq, much as in the Arab Spring, and the United States is hoping to use these protests in order to reduce the influence of Iran. In the region. And the same applies in Lebanon. I mean, for the United States, what really bugs them about Lebanon is Hezbollah. It wants to minimize everything. It can do everything it can to minimize the influence of Hezbollah. But of course, Hezbollah is a powerful movement, and it has allies among the Christian population. So any attempt, really, to fight some kind of a proxy war against Hezbollah will lead to an absolute catastrophe in Lebanon. It could reignite the civil war, which ended in 1990. The same applies to Iraq. I mean, the more you kind of push these protests, the more likely that the civil war of 10 years ago will once again start.
And then it's very interesting because Prime Minister Adel Abdel Mahdi, who almost was losing his job as was about to resign, he appointed, he's the point man of Tehran, it's an understood thing, but then he was appointed as a compromise so that the US would also accept him. I mean, it seems almost that finally the situation has used its sort of reached its climax where it's the control that the US and Iran had in the region is spinning fast out of control. Mr. Ghafuri, your thoughts?
Well, if we see that like Adel Abdel Mahdi, he's the prime minister of Iraq, he's very favorable guy for the Iranian Islamic regime. I gotta say that even in the New York Times and Intercept leaked documents, we witnessed that Abdel Mahdi had a very special connection with Iran back in when he was an oil minister of 2014. Iraq. But he became the prime minister as a compromise. I agree. Adel Abdel Mahdi, he was being agreed by both United States and Iran, but at the end we see that Iranian regime and the Iraqi government, let's say, it's had more ties with Iran and Tehran than even before. Like we're talking about the days of Haider al-Abadi, the former prime minister. We witnessed that Adel Abdel Mahdi had made many let's say talks and agreements with Iran regarding the electricity and also business trade, and we witnessed that Iraq is having trade business with Iran to more than 12 billion, which is they were expecting to increase by end of 2020 to 20 billion. And that's something that is Washington is not happy with, and I believe the people is not happy with. We need to talk about the people of Iraq as well. The people are fed up with the external influence and of the regional countries' influence in Iraq. We're talking about Iraq, United States, everyone, because the Iraqi people now are demanding for an independent government that it works and decides on its own and puts Iraq first. Because I have to be in touch with a lot of protesters in Baghdad and other parts of Iraq. The demand is they want a change of the system and a change of a regime that they can bring someone or a regime or a government that can make the people in Iraq first. And the decisions are coming from inside Iraq, not outside.
And is that, Mr. Szamuely, a possibility? It could be achieved peacefully in these countries, in Iraq, in Lebanon, that this ruling elite, where dynasties have ruled for decades upon decades, could be removed. And the demands of the protesters could be met with a new government, with amendments to the Constitution that would be agreeable?
Well, that would be an excellent start. I don't think that it's very likely because this proxy war between the United States and Iran is ongoing, and it will be ongoing for the foreseeable future. Iran is a regional power. It is not going to just go away. The Iraqis know that it's not going to go away. Again, I mean, once the Saddam Hussein regime was overthrown, it was inevitable that Iran's influence would grow within Iraq. I mean, not only is 60% of the population Shiite, but they are Shiite who look to Iran for leadership. So that's not going to go away. If the United States continues to wage this proxy war with Lebanon, with Iran in Lebanon and in Iraq, then there's not going to be any kind of addressing of the grievances of the people. There is just going to be chaos and ultimately civil war. So, it's at the moment, this policy of the U.S. to fight this proxy war against a regional power that isn't going to go away. It's not going away next year. It's not going away in a decade's time. It will be there in perpetuity. To continue to wage this hopeless war, I think, is going to lead to civil war in Iraq and in Lebanon.
And there is a civil war, essentially, isn't it? Mr. Ghafuri, just your thoughts here on whether do you think this moving forward can be resolved peacefully, or is this going to continue without any kind of regime change in these countries?
Well, I don't in Iraq. I don't think that a regime which is 16 years old and then it's keep on being powerful, and now in 1 month it can be toppled down or change it. I think the people will be the people are keep protesting. I think the people are very keen on changing the regime. The regime is to change the regime. We need a lot of, let's say, regional countries to have approval of that. Like we're talking about the United States, we're talking about Iran. Everyone, we changing the regime in Iraq is not an easy job. I think Iran currently is refusing to change Adil Abdul Mahdi as a prime minister of Iraq. And we see that the United States had statements that talking about snap election and changing of the government. The people, I think the people of Iraq today are the winners, in my opinion, because they had this wide nation protest since 1st of October. And I think the picture that we saw in Iraq, the people who been very united.
So you're saying the people of Iraq are essentially the winners here, but there's you're not feeling very positive of there being even a possibility of a regime change. Well, Mr. Lawk, Ghafuri and Mr. George Szamuely, thank you so much for joining us here on this conversation on Newswire. We will be taking a quick short break. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. Discussing today, we are taking a look at these revolts taking place, these protests taking place in Iraq, in Lebanon, and now in Iran, and try to understand if there is an overreaching influence of regional players behind maintaining the status quo of the powers that be in these countries. So let me introduce our guests who will be talking to us today. We have with us Mr. Toni Nissi. He is an analyst and the Secretary General of the National Council for the Cedar Revolution. He's joining us from Beirut today. And we have Mr. Matthew Bryza, former diplomat, joining us from Istanbul. Welcome to both of you to the show. If I could start with you, Mr. Nissi, you have been part of a very important revolution in Lebanon back in 2005. It was a huge outpouring of people, of Lebanese, in the St. Martin's Square today, where again protesters are demanding that the same feudal sort of dynasties, the ruling elite, be removed and be held accountable for the corruption. What is the change that you see this time round, if any?
The people of Lebanon, they gave the power to the politicians who tried to compromise with others to reach the goals of the revolution. What really happened is that the compromise reached to a corrupted people, reached to a country where all the free people were arrested and they were kept away from the freedom of speech. And at the same time, people are feeling hunger. They are feeling that their country is ruled by Iran and by Hezbollah. So now they are doing their revolution because actually they are asking for many things, starting by getting back their country from the leaders, from the so-called leaders who are in power right now. At the same time, they want all the money stolen by these leaders to be rehabilitated again. At the same time, they want all the politicians to leave, even those who has been trusted in 2005 to lead the revolution and to achieve the revolution goals. Now we are living a new phase of the revolution. Lebanon is going to be a free country, I guess, hopefully soon with this revolution. And this time, we are aiming to achieve all of our goals to reach a democratic, pluralist, and sovereign Lebanon.
Okay, so there is a lot of optimism there, Mr. Nissi, from you, but I still have to again ask that compared to what happened in 2005, and as you say, this is Cedar Revolution 2.0, and back then, even though there was some changes, there was those 8 months of protest, they brought around some accountability, but do you have confidence that this time round, that same feudal party ruling system, that can be changed as it wasn't back then?
The people are asking all the party leaders to leave. They are asking all the politicians to leave. Now we are living a real revolution, and we are asking these people to have their own leadership coming from them, elected democratically. Actually, we're not asking the same people and the same parties to lead the country again. We're asking them to leave the floor for new leadership coming from the people who are now on the streets. So the first goal of the revolution is to have the government resign. The second goal is to have a government made out of experts and not from politicians. Third, we need a new parliament elections. So what we are willing right now is to change all the regime, to change all the politicians who are in power, and to have newly elected people based on their CVs, based on their capacities, and based on how they can now be able, first, to get back the economy on track.
Right.
Second, to be able to handle the situation politically, militarily, and to deal with the free world in a proper way to reach a free country.
Okay, all right. Let's ask Mr. Matthew Bryza if he sees the possibility as well. Mr. Bryza, the question I'm essentially sort of was hoping to, the point I was trying to get at was Iran's role here. Iran's been a financial, a political, a military support for Lebanon's Hezbollah. And, they played a role that is not as recent as the past few years, but goes back decades. With that Hezbollah in power and being threatened to be removed, do you think there is any possibility that what the protesters of Lebanon are asking for can be achieved?
Well, I certainly hope it can be achieved, and Mr. Nissi knows infinitely more than I do about the possibility of the goals actually being achieved. But I think deeper at your question, I think you're asking, will Iran permit this to happen, right, with the influence of Hezbollah on the ground? And, well, Iran is kind of running out of the ability to call the shots in a lot of places. Iran has effectively been at war for quite a long time. I mean, the war in Yemen is essentially a proxy war. Iran has been fighting on the ground in Syria, often with military forces that are not in uniform. Iranian militias were fighting in Iraq against ISIS. Iran plays such an outsized political role in Iraq. And that all costs a lot of money. And money that the Iranian government really clearly does not have, which is why there are these protests now happening also in Iran. So I think, as I'm saying, I think Iran's ability to shape these events is limited and showing its limits. Now, the question, though, is can all the various groupings in the most fractious of political places, Lebanon, which is kind of the template for sectarianism and political division, can the groups that are in the opposition, as Mr. Nissi said, come together to oust the current government and then elect that technocratic government of experts. Now, I lived through, while I worked in the White House, the Georgian Revolution, the Rose Revolution. That's exactly what the Georgians did. They convinced then President Eduard Shevardnadze to leave. Then a group of very young reformers, late 20s and early 30s, came to power, and they enacted very powerful reforms that kept them popular. But after a while being elites, people kind of lost sight of the lofty goals, became comfortable, and then wanted to preserve their power. Fortunately, in Georgia, they had put in place sufficiently strong institutions that there was a democratic transition in October of 2012. But now people are on the streets again, thinking that government is now not living up to the revolutionary goals. So I guess what I'm saying is there's a long road ahead in Lebanon, but I pray that the various opposition people will unite and get their say.
But then, so what you're essentially saying also is that Iran doesn't seem to have the kind of power, the money, the backing, or the hold that it used to, especially with these U.S. crippling sanctions. And what we're now also seeing them hiking petrol prices, that's started the protests in their own country. But then what do you make of the statement that Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei said on Wednesday last week? He claimed that U.S. and Western intelligence agencies were making chaos in Lebanon, in Iraq, where protesters have, essentially also went against and protested against Iran. So what do you make of his statement? Do you see any kind of weightage in what he's suggesting?
I don't. I mean, that's the typical thing an autocratic leader says, whether it's Vladimir Putin, for your own failings, for your own shortcomings. The last thing that the United States wants in Iraq, of all places, is chaos. The last thing the United States wants is instability. Having been such a creator of instability there, the United States has been trying for the past 2 decades to put the pieces back together. In Iran, sure, the U.S. government would like to see the regime destabilized, but in my opinion, the United States does not have the assets on the ground, the intelligence operatives and networks to create that sort of chaos. That is genuine distress being expressed by the Iranian people. And frankly, it's insulting to them or to the people of Lebanon to say, you're not brave enough, you're not smart enough, you're not wise enough to know what you want and to go out there on the streets and to have your own protests.
Mr. Nissi, would you agree with what Mr. Bryza has said? What is your take on what Khamenei has claimed that the Western forces, the U.S. is behind the chaos in Lebanon? How would you respond to that?
I don't think that the United States wants a chaos in Lebanon. Actually, the United States are building the biggest embassy in the Middle East here, and they are supporting the Lebanese army with millions of dollars on a yearly basis. And I think they want Lebanon to be stable. But we as a revolution right now, we believe that we cannot achieve our goals alone, and no revolution on earth can achieve the goals without international recognition. So we are addressing the free world to tell them that we really need your support. We really need your support to help us to get rid of what's happening on the ground. Mm-hmm. Especially that, as Matt said, Iran is pumping millions of dollars every year in Lebanon Maybe now they are weaker, they are not able to pump the same amount of money, but Lebanon now is sinking. And we need the free world to support us. And we're trying to convince everybody. We've been to the European Parliament. We had a conference there on November 14. We're talking to the Americans. We're talking to the British. We're talking to everybody. And at the same time, we're putting all the pressure on the ground because what we really need right now, Matt is right. Our first revolution, it kicks the Syrians out of Lebanon. But we couldn't achieve our goals because the politicians in Lebanon compromise with terror. And they compromise with terror because they reach corruption, high level of corruption.
Right.
This is our second revolution right now because we are willing to continue our goals, to have Lebanon free from Iran, Israel, and Syria, to have Lebanon free of corruption, to have Lebanon free of bad people sitting on the chairs and they are willing to stay there forever.
Right.
So we believe that we know and we understand very well that it's a long way to go. And we believe that it's going to be tough. Maybe it's going to be very hard, but we are willing to go to the end. We are willing to free our country. We are willing to live in peace with other communities living on the land.
Right. But Mr. Bryza, do you see that there is an opportunity being lost here by President Trump's administration? He's really busy with his own, plate full of problems with the impeachment inquiry going on and him campaigning for 2020. But at the cost of the kind of democratic, promotion that the U.S. has always been behind, the advocates of democracy, maybe losing an opportunity in what is happening in the Middle East at the moment?
Yeah, well, I think, yes, the United States is losing the opportunity to promote democratic and economic freedom all over the world. It started under President Obama. I'm not anti-Obama or pro-Trump. I mean, President Obama appointed me as ambassador to Azerbaijan. But, it was under President Obama that we started to walk away from President George W. Bush's freedom agenda. And President Bush was attacked, and rightfully so, for the invasion of Iraq. But if you look at the second term of President Bush, it was all about the belief that there cannot be political stability in the long run anywhere without political and economic freedom. It may sound like a cliche. Perhaps the United States used the wrong methods to achieve those objectives in Iraq. That was certainly the case. But as Lebanon is showing, as Iraq is showing now, as Iran is showing, there is no way around the fact that if people don't feel free, or Hong Kong is showing, if people don't feel free, there will eventually be instability. The question is, can there be an inspirational role by the United States that even if the U.S. isn't intervening in Lebanon, right? Does that the model of a shining city on the hill that Ronald Reagan used to talk about still hold true? And it doesn't under Donald Trump, unfortunately.
So, Mr. Bryza, I want a similar sort of thread of this thought process you're behind to our new guest who's just joining us, an analyst from Tehran, Mr. Hamid Gholamzadeh. Welcome back to Newswire. We are tackling quite a few sort of channels here in this debate. One of them is, could the U.S. do better in the role it could play at a time where protests are overtaking Lebanon and Iraq? But at the same time, there is a debate also going on with the recent release of Iran cables, documents generated by the Ministry of Intelligence and Security of Iran, documents that essentially show, and should be very worrying for the U.S. at this point, that Iran has much more of an upper hand in Iraq since the 2003 U.S. invasion.
The point is that the United States is incapable of doing anything for freedom because it doesn't have the means to help freedom and democracy for other countries when itself doesn't have any of them, neither democracy nor freedom nor whatever it is. But the point about the region is that you cannot compare the protests in Iraq, in Lebanon, and in Iran to each other. They are not similar to each other at all. All of them are totally different from each other because the nations and the cultures are totally different. That's the point. But unfortunately, the analysts and officials in the West cannot understand these differences among the people.
Well, one thing we do know is that these protests have been sparked by price hikes, the inability of the youth to get jobs, basic civil rights. I mean, these economies are tanking. that is a common thread. You're suggesting it seems that there is a huge difference in what is happening in Lebanon, in Iraq, and now what we're seeing in Iran also.
The economic woes is the only thing they have in common, right? People are protesting against the economic woes and problems. So that's why. But you can see people in Lebanon are acting and reacting differently from those in Iraq. In Iraq, it was more violent than in Lebanon. The Lebanon, you could see a lot of fun. I mean, the protest. You had dances on the streets, you had gambling and playing and such things on the streets of Lebanon when they were actually protesting. So the cultures are totally different. And the point about Iran is that, yes, people are very angry with the economic situation and the price hike of the fuel. But the point is that the unrest, the violence that has happened in Iraq is not something by the people. All the evidences and the witnesses are saying that those who are erupting the violence, they are actually the hooligans and the vandalists are someone from other places. They are not locals in the areas that we are witnessing actually the unrest. So in Iran, what it seems is that the violence, I'm not saying protest, the violence is something apparently being guided and directed from outside.
You're saying you're saying actually what your Supreme Leader Khamenei has said earlier last week, in fact, that these protests perpetuated, this chaos has been perpetuated and instigated by the West. But at the same time, what we're seeing from these Iran leaks, a unprecedented amount of data being leaked, which is, Iran is renowned for protecting its security and intelligence reports. It states very clearly that Iran has a much bigger role to play in how the governments are controlled or carry out their business, especially in Iraq.
Yeah, that's right, because the security of Iran and Iraq is connected to each other and it's interwoven. You cannot separate the security of the two countries from each other because they are two neighboring countries. They have a lot of in common in terms of culture, religion, and such things. And so that's right. Yes, of course, Iran has more role than the United States in Iraq.
So then it's a bigger concern here that if their security is connected to Iran or what is happening in Iraq, it is a bigger concern that is this snowball effect going to get worse? I mean, we've seen these protests in Iran are not, you can't possibly tell me that these are, again, Western instigated because they happened right after your government increased price of oil.
No, it's not going to be a snowballing because in Iran, it will be contained and people themselves will actually stand against the violence. Protest, civil protest, peaceful protest is the right, the basic right to everyone, and everyone has acknowledged that from the supreme leader in Iran.
I want to come back with you to you, Mr. Bryza. This debate over Iran's influence, of it petering out, maybe, especially in light of the shocking revelations that these Iran cables reveal, the kind of hold they have in the government of Iraq, especially in terms of intelligence matters. I mean, there was actually a foreign minister an ambassador to Iraq from 2010 to 2017, it was Hassan Danefa, who actually admitted and said that, yes, Iran does have an upper hand here when it comes to information gathering in Iraq. Does it concern you that this might get worse and spread across the region and not just be contained to these three countries?
One thing I agree with, what the previous guest was saying was that each of the situations is so different. I mean, I do think that in Iraq, some of the unrest is fueled by Iran, certainly across the whole region, the area stretching from the Gulf all the way to the Mediterranean. And it is Iran that has been sowing instability and that has been pouring fuel on the fire, if you will. So in that sense, it's already spread. One of the great failures of the United States in Iraq is that military intervention and the U.S.'s failure to restore stability and build the economy in Iraq clear the way for Iran. And you're going to have a Shiite majority running Iraq forever because the Shiites are the majority population that were mistreated under the old regime, the Ba'ath regime of Saddam Hussein. So if the United States was in favor of putting in place a democratic system in Iraq, the United States, my colleagues at the time, should have realized it's going to clear the way for Iranian influence. But that being said, the unrest in Iran, which I do believe is genuine, as we've discussed, is reflecting enduring economic weakness in Iran that's getting worse as the government proves itself unable to provide jobs and the fulfillment of the dreams and aspirations of younger Iranians. That limits Iranian power and will forever, but that doesn't mean Iran has no power. It has tremendous influence in Iraq, as you were saying.
All right, it has tremendous influence in Iraq. Mr. Bryza, Mr. Nissi, and Mr. Gholamzadeh, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts here and your analysis. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. It's time to say goodbye. We will be seeing you tomorrow with a new episode of Newswire with more stories to look into. Goodbye.